Hi, folks. If you're new here, I'm Tommy. I'm a biostatistician by research and an eco-evo-geobiologist by education, and I have finally been admitted to doctoral candidacy. God, does it feel good to say that. I passed the last of my candidacy exams, finally. If you want to see my dissertation proposal, or any of the stuff related to my research, check out my other channel, TommyThePaleontologist, linked below. And while we're on the topic of other channels, I'm also an amateur electronic musician, and I'll link to the channel that hosts my music, though some of my older stuff can be found on this channel. At the time of this recording, I just finished a black metal cover of Frank Sinatra's Witchcraft, and I had a blast saying cute shit in my demon voice. Now that I have the time for things like scripts and rehearsals and other such luxuries, and also an upgrade to Filmora, I want to tackle something that's been bothering me for a while. But first, just a quick channel update. This video took longer to produce than I thought, so my second annual Autism Awareness Month coverage will start next week, hopefully. As a professional scientist working in evolutionary biology, who is also a Platonic idealist and therefore a theist, I'm often asked how I can believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. And usually, I'm asked this in a tone that could be charitably described as derisive. The people asking this are usually what I like to call epistemic atheists. Epistemic atheists make the positive claim that God claims are insufficiently epistemically justified, which is to say they require more epistemic justification. This is usually expressed colloquially as there is no evidence for God. In fact, I was an epistemic atheist for 10 years of my life, so I'm not unsympathetic to their position. You can check out my video in defense of agnosticism for more details on my epistemic atheism definition. But since the majority of movement atheists are, in actuality, epistemic atheists, I will just go ahead and call it atheism for short going forward. Those madly typing in the comments, if you merely lack a belief in God, I am not talking about you. Since epistemic atheism does make positive claims, I'm going to answer what I think are the 10 most popular atheist arguments from the perspective of an epistemic theist. But first, I have a few important caveats. I'm a Platonist. I'm not a classical theist. I basically believe that God is the only thing that really exists, and we all exist as contingent thoughts within the mind of that God. And that's the version of God I'm defending here. So I won't address arguments like the problem of evil or problems with specific religious claims, though I do want to say that I think the Bible rather strongly teaches against omnibenevolence as it's conventionally understood. Most of my videos tend to assume some background knowledge in philosophy, so normally I wouldn't define epistemic justification, but since this video might have an appeal to those outside of us philosophy nerds, I guess I probably should. So philosophers distinguish between the truth of a claim and its epistemic justification, which is the sufficiency of reasons for believing a claim. So perhaps an example would be helpful. Suppose I want to know the time. Suppose I look over at my analog wall clock and it says 11 a.m. We're not here debating whether it really is 11 o'clock. That's the truth of the claim. We're rather debating whether the average person would be rational for believing it's 11 o'clock, given that the clock face said it was 11 o'clock. By analogy, I am claiming the clock face is sufficient, while the atheist, by analogy, is claiming that perhaps I need to have, waited for the clock face to change to confirm the clock hasn't stopped, or corroborate this time with another clock. And of course, I would concede that that might sound reasonable if I had reason to suspect that the clock was wrong. But on the atheist view, again by analogy, it's a commitment to the idea that I should corroborate the time this way, either looking at two clocks or waiting, every time I want to know what the time is, or else be irrational. So one thing I won't be explaining in depth in this video is the argument that a single necessary mind has the highest relative prior probability of all possible candidate explanations for reality, if we accept Occam's razor, the cogito, and the principle that at least one object must exist. I have a whole video on this, appropriately titled The Argument for God That Made Me Leave Atheism, going through the formal logic of this argument. It's going to be linked somewhere. But the intuition is pretty easy, right? Any deviation from the single necessary mind reduces parsimony, increases the number of objects, the number of categories of objects, decreases explanatory power. And if we accept Occam's razor, that must mean that it has the highest prior probability. I believe this argument is sufficient epistemic justification for a God belief, which is why it caused me to abandon epistemic atheism. But I do also believe there is a posteriori or evidential justification for a belief in God as well. And so, even though I bring this up in like a third of my videos, it's worth explaining again. Studies into the evolution of the senses have made a very compelling argument that the material world is probably an illusion. The reason for this is that the acquisition cost of accurate knowledge often outweighs the fitness benefits gained from accurate information relative to useful but less accurate constructs. If you saw my video on Flat Earth, that conversation should probably be familiar to you. So if you believe in evolution, you can't really believe that matter is very likely to exist. And we should probably not treat matter as our default assumption anyway. My philosophy peeps who've read David Hume would also know that there's no experiment I can do to distinguish between a really existing material object and an identical bundle of properties. One of my first videos I did on this channel in September 2020, I believe it's called The Evolutionary Argument for Spiritualism, argues that based on these facts, a very special kind of personal experience, verified personal gnosis, is more consistent with actual perception than an evolutionarily induced mass hallucination. I'm not going to rehash that argument here, though I will later on go through more reasons as to why I think this kind of personal experience is evidence. I should say also that much of the intellectual work behind verified personal gnosis has been laid by the neo-pagan community, and I'll link a couple of videos explaining the concept of verified personal gnosis from neo-pagan creators. So, with that said, argument 1, it's irrational to believe a proposition without evidence. Thus, at least evidence is required for epistemic justification, at least for a posteriori claims. There are many problems defining evidence, most famously the Raven paradox, and I'll link to a video explaining that. But if by evidence you simply mean epistemic justification, well, of course I would agree with you because that's a tautology. It's irrational to believe without a reason to believe. But if you mean scientific evidence, well, most scientists accept a Bayesian definition of evidence, an observation that changes the prior probability of an hypothesis to a new posterior probability. There are problems with this definition too, but it's good enough for our purposes. The position that only Bayesian evidence can serve as justification is sometimes called evidentialism. So here's the question. Do we think we're justified in believing in extraterrestrial life, or I guess extrasolar life? I'm not talking about like little green men in spaceships. I'm talking about somewhere else in the universe there is life. Because it seems like we are justified in believing that, given everything we know about how abiogenesis worked on Earth, and even if abiogenesis is extremely unlikely, the vast scale of the universe would virtually guarantee life would arise elsewhere, right? And yet, if we are justified in believing in extraterrestrial life, based on these prior probability arguments, we are justified in believing claims, scientific claims, mind you, without evidence. And indeed, we may never actually have any real evidence for extraterrestrial life, depending on how far out it might be. Since we're using a Bayesian definition of evidence, I propose we advance a Bayesian definition of justification. I am justified in believing a proposition, an a posteriori proposition, without evidence if the prior probability of that position exceeds some relevant threshold. And since the prior probability of the Platonic God is higher than any other explanation for reality, it seems like I am justified in believing in God for the same reasons. And the evidentialist position has led to absurdities in other areas of science. So before the Nobel Prize-winning discovery of Pegasi 51b, many scientists rejected the existence of exoplanets, despite exoplanets being virtually guaranteed to exist based on their very high prior probability and everything we knew about the physics of planet formation. Argument 2. What is presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. This little quippy statement, sometimes called Hitchens' razor, is a snarkier version of the former. Essentially, arguments without evidence don't even need to be considered. But I think it fails for much of the same reasoning as argument 1. Hey guys, life elsewhere in the universe is almost certain to exist. Up, we can dismiss that out of hand. It's not even worth discussing because there's no evidence. That just strikes me as absurd, right? Argument 3. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I agree with this, but who gets to define extraordinariness? If we take extraordinariness to be low prior probability, which is what most scientists mean when they say something is extraordinary, then God isn't an extraordinary claim at all, since again, his prior probability is pretty high. Argument 4. The burden of proof is on the claimant. So atheists love this argument, but you rarely hear them articulate a reason for why this should be true. And no, it's not because you can't prove a negative, because in many cases you can. I could prove that there are no elephants in my studio apartment right now, for example. Well, if we're using the Bayesian definition of evidence and justification, we can use a Bayesian definition for burdens as well. The burden of proof lies on the party making the claim with the lower prior probability. To wit, the burden of proof lies on the person making the more extraordinary claim. This still preserves our intuitions about things like Bigfoot. All else being equal, the existence of a contingent entity is less parsimonious than its non-existence, and therefore less likely. But, as it applies to God, 1. We posit a God that is a necessary entity, if we're right, and 2. Any particular non-God explanation for the universe is, based on our Bayesian analysis, a more extraordinary claim. One could argue, if one were so inclined, that those who reject the existence of the Platonic God have an extraordinary claim and have the burden of proof. Argument 5. God is unfalsifiable. Well, maybe he is, but I'm unconvinced that falsifiability is meaningful anyway. The logic behind falsifiability assumes a very strict Boolean algebra approach, which doesn't play well with the defeasiblism we usually use in science. And it's pretty easy to exploit the contradictions between those two logic systems to prove, in my favorite example, the moon being made of rocks rather than cheese falsifies evolution. To prove this to yourself, consider the following statement. If evolution is true, the moon is made of cheese. Of course, if evolution, as it is described by science, isn't perfectly accurate, then evolution should be assigned a Boolean truth value of false. But false antecedents make for true conditionals, so the above sentence is true. I leave the rest of the syllogism as an exercise to the viewer. There is also the auxiliary hypothesis problem we discussed in that video on Gettier problems. And besides, extraterrestrial life is a practically unfalsifiable claim, depending on, again, where that life in the universe is located relative to us. But if you go back and read Karl Popper's original paper that introduced the idea of falsifiability as a virtue, he's clearly talking about how pseudoscientists refuse to name falsifying conditions. Under what conditions would you reject your hypothesis? And I think that's fair. Under what conditions would I be willing to abandon my belief in God? For me, it all comes down to a lack of compelling arguments for the reality of matter. So if I were presented with a compelling argument for the reality of matter, I would probably abandon my belief in the Platonic God. Argument 6. We strive to know as many true things and as few false things as possible, and therefore we should embrace a restrictive epistemology. This argument was popularized by Matt Dillahunty, whom I've said before I have immense respect for, and I had a few conversations with him back when I was an atheist activist. Of course, the problem with this argument is the same as the problem with perception and evolution anyway. The cost of increasing accuracy doesn't keep up with the benefits of that acquired accuracy. Returning to our clock example. If we care about optimizing the number of true beliefs we hold, then we should be willing to check 2 clocks, or to check that the clock is working each time we want to know what time it is. But for most of us, the inconvenience of doing that outweighs the risk associated with getting the time wrong. It's really only in time-critical cases where there is an extraordinary risk to getting the time wrong that we would even bother doing that. And believing in God, not a particular religion, but the belief in God as a philosophical conclusion, doesn't seem to be a high enough risk to justify such a highly restrictive epistemology. Argument 7. Scientific skepticism is a virtue, so we should embrace evidentialism. So I tend not to take virtue epistemology very seriously, and I'm not going to really bother responding to virtue epistemology arguments. But so long as we're talking about virtue and skepticism, scientific skepticism, or so-called rational skepticism, as a movement, is highly associated with neoliberal reactionary politics. I've done more than one video talking about Richard Dawkins' ableism and his transphobia. Bigfoot skepticism is embedded in an anti-indigenous colonialism, and skepticism around spiritualism and mediumship just happens to have been directed at a movement that was, at the time, led by women and strongly abolitionist. So it seems like virtue is inimical to rational scientific skepticism. Argument 8. God is unnecessary to explain the universe. So back when I was an atheist, this was the actual reason I didn't believe. And for most of the atheists I knew, it was true for them. They didn't believe because of this argument. That lack of evidence crap was a rhetorical tactic to win debates. Now, I left movement atheism in about 2013, so perhaps genuine epistemic atheists are more represented today than they were back then. But forgive me for not believing you if you claim you don't believe in God merely because you lack evidence. The crux of the argument is, God is unnecessary to explain the universe, so there's no scientific need for positing a God. Science explains everything, so why need a God? Of course, the problem with this is, as most philosophers of science will tell you, science works best when constrained to the phenomenal, to the realm of appearance. So sure, God is scientifically unnecessary, but that's irrelevant. So, for example, suppose I'm playing a video game and I want to understand the game's physics engine. I can describe the in-game physics without once making an appeal to the software or hardware that the game is running on. But that has no bearing on the existence of the hardware or software the game is running on. And as far as universal explanations go, God is still the best one. In this case, God is the equivalent to the game system. And of course, if evolution is true, science doesn't explain non-phenomenological systems anyway. So you need to posit a universe in which God doesn't exist, but also creationism occurred. Argument 9. Even if God were to exist, he has no impact on the world and is meaningless, and therefore, from a pragmatic epistemology standpoint, is unjustified. So maybe if you view God the way many American evangelicals do, as a celestial ATM, then this is a fair criticism. But from more mystical traditions that value God as an internal experience of the divine, so for example, Jnana Hinduism, Sufism, or the hesychasts of Orthodox Christianity, then you start to appreciate the experience of the divine in and of itself. Having started down the road to theism through mystical experiences myself, God's existence has had a powerful impact on my life. Argument 10. Personal experience is not evidence. On its own, personal experience is not evidence. But when those personal experiences are generally consistent across time and cultures, what we call verified personal gnosis, that does, I think, rise to the level of scientific evidence. Sure, it can't get you to a specific religion, but it can get you to the paranormal, as most cultures have the equivalents of angels, demons, and ghosts. And when mystical experiences are accounted for, to God. Now, I've dealt with a bunch of objections to this in that old video, but I want to offer a response to the objection that verified personal gnosis has inconsistencies, and that's not entirely wrong, which is why I've caveated VPG to preclude specific religious claims. But it's important to understand that predicates are bound up in culture. For example, many cultures do not distinguish between blue and green, and color is something the vast majority of the human race can see. So inconsistencies between cultures in describing experiences the majority of the people of the world don't experience at all isn't terribly surprising. But, of course, common predicates can be developed over time through cross-cultural discussions of verified personal gnosis, which is why it's so important to talk about. And as my Autism Awareness Month coverage proceeds in the weeks ahead, I want to talk a lot about how lived experience, which is basically a form of verified personal gnosis. For example, the lived experience of ABA as abuse experienced by the autistic community isn't an attempt to get out of science, but rather to argue, perhaps, that our science is not representatively sampling the true distribution of the variable. So, to sum this up then, I believe in a very specific version of God, because it can be shown a priori to be the most parsimonious explanation, and because of my and other experiences of the divine as VPG. That's the equivalent to my reading 11 on the wall clock. I think this reasoning and evidence, respectively, is consistent with a Bayesian standard of justification, and an evolutionary utilitarian risk-based model of an evolutionary paradigm. Reading the time on the clock is sufficient to rationally hold the time, even if there's a small chance I'm wrong. That's all for now, folks. See you next time, and God bless.